The courtroom was packed with journalists and members of the public. Karoline Leavitt stood confidently before the judge, presenting her argument in a case of corruption within the city administration. But the judge, a gray-haired man with a weary yet mocking expression, interrupted her with a cold smirk. "Girl, do you even understand where you are? Politics isn't for people like you. I won't even entertain this circus." Karoline clenched her fists but didn't let her emotions take over. A tense silence filled the room. Then, a firm voice rang out from the front row. "Your Honor, do you realize you've just committed an official misconduct?" Pam Bondi rose from her seat, her gaze cold as steel. The judge paled but still tried to maintain his composure. "Are you threatening me, Miss Bondi? I'm reminding you of the law. And they," she pointed toward the entrance, where federal agents were already standing, "will remind you of the consequences." Seconds later, the judge, who had once considered himself untouchable, was standing in handcuffs. Karoline watched with cold satisfaction. In this game, the winners aren't the ones who shout the loudest but those who know exactly when to strike. What happened next made everyone in the courtroom fall silent and changed someone's life forever. But before we continue, let's find out where you're from. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story just for you. Karoline Leavitt stood before the judge, confidently presenting evidence of corruption within the city administration. But the judge, known for his tough and unyielding nature, suddenly interrupted her with a smirk. "Girl, do you even understand where you are? Politics isn't for people like you." The courtroom fell silent. Karoline didn't flinch, but she felt a tightness in her chest. She knew this trial would be tough, but she hadn't expected open mockery in court. The silence in the courtroom became oppressive. Eyes darted between the judge and Karoline. Some journalists had already begun whispering, preparing to document the scandalous moment. Karoline felt her heart pounding in her chest, but outwardly, she remained composed. She was about to respond when a firm, confident voice cut through the tension. "Your Honor, you have just committed an official misconduct." The murmurs in the room ceased. All heads turned toward the source of the voice. Pam Bondi, former Attorney General, rose from her seat. Her gaze was as cold as steel. It was the look of someone who had spent years upholding the law and enforcing it. Pam took a few deliberate steps forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, slicing through the eerie silence. The judge narrowed his eyes, as if trying to assess the situation, but the fear flickering in them betrayed him. "Don't you think your bias is a little too obvious?" Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable warning beneath the surface. "How dare you?" The judge attempted to smirk, but it came off nervous. "I am the one presiding over this trial, not you." Pam crossed her arms. "And it seems you're doing so with clear prejudice. Or do you believe you can humiliate one side of the case without consequences?" The judge scowled. He clearly hadn't expected resistance, especially not from Pam Bondi. Journalists adjusted their cameras, fingers racing across keyboards. This was the moment that could turn the entire case upside down. Karoline glanced at Pam. Her support wasn't just important, it could change the course of everything. "Are you threatening me, Miss Bondi?" The judge's voice was tight, controlled. He didn't want to show fear, but a cold sweat had already broken out on his forehead. Pam didn't flinch. "I am reminding you of the law you swore to uphold." Soft murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Some attorneys and observers exchanged glances. The judge was losing control. Karoline could feel the weight of the moment. The judge nervously adjusted his robe, as if trying to maintain his dignity. He looked at Pam, then at Karoline, like a cornered beast searching for an escape. "This is a court of law, not a political rally. I will not allow this circus. And I will not allow you to break the law." Pam cut him off mid-sentence. The judge abruptly stood up, his face turning red with anger. He opened his mouth to protest, but at that moment, the doors swung open, and federal agents entered the room. Everyone froze. The judge turned to see the badges on their jackets and instantly paled. Pam didn't even need to explain her presence, her words had already sealed the moment. One of the agents approached the judge. "Your Honor, you need to come with us. We have a warrant for your arrest." Chaos erupted in the room. Cameras flashed, journalists' voices merged into a collective buzz. The judge took a step back, but the agents were already closing in. Karoline watched as the man who had mocked her just moments ago now looked small, defeated. The judge tried to protest, but his voice wavered. He glanced at Pam, then at Karoline, and in that instant, realization struck him: he had lost. "You have no right. This is a conspiracy." His voice no longer carried the same authority. Pam simply smirked. "This is the law. Get used to it." As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around the judge's wrists, Karoline felt an unexpected wave of relief. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. She turned to Pam, who gave her a subtle nod, as if to say, "Now you know what it means to fight for the truth." Karoline exhaled. This was just the first step. Karoline could feel the tension thick in the air. Seconds stretched like hours. The judge pressed his lips into a thin line, his eyes darting from Karoline to Pam Bondi, then to the agents at the door. He clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. "Are you threatening me, Miss Bondi?" His voice, usually steady and authoritative, now wavered. Pam raised an eyebrow, her face remaining cold and unreadable. "I'm reminding you of the law, the same law you just publicly violated." Journalists in the room were already whispering among themselves. The cameras recorded every word. The judge knew that every move he made now would be scrutinized. Suddenly, he slammed his fist on the desk. "This is a courtroom, not a political show. You have no right to interfere." His voice boomed across the hall, but it sounded more like a desperate attempt to regain control. Karoline's heartbeat quickened. Pam took another step forward, her eyes flashing. "Do you think power gives you the right to humiliate people? Do you think the law is just a tool for manipulation?" Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Your time is up." The murmurs in the courtroom turned into a loud murmur. Some people whispered into their phones, while others were already typing urgent news updates. The judge noticed this and nervously scanned the room. "You." He took a shaky breath. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." For the first time, Karoline allowed herself a small smile. "No, it's you who doesn't understand who you're dealing with." At that moment, one of the federal agents stepped forward and handed over a document. The judge looked at it, and his face turned pale. Pam kept her eyes locked on him. "I assume you're familiar with these papers. This is an official order for an investigation into your actions. Your connections to corrupt officials have been exposed. Today, you leave this courtroom, not as a judge, but as a defendant." Just then, the courtroom doors swung open, and additional agents entered. The judge tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but there wasn't a single ally left. Even his own clerks lowered their eyes, avoiding his gaze. "This is a mistake. A setup." The judge attempted to sound confident, but his voice trembled. "The only mistake was believing you could break the law without consequences," Pam said, stepping even closer, now face to face with him. Karoline stood beside her, adrenaline rushing through her veins. She knew this moment would change her life forever. "You have two choices," Pam continued calmly. "You can leave this courtroom voluntarily, or in handcuffs. Make your choice." The judge looked at her, then at Karoline, then at the agents. He swallowed hard. The silence in the room was suffocating. He wanted to argue, but he knew no one would believe him. Seconds stretched into eternity. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh, pulled off his judge's robe, and tossed it onto the desk. "You will all pay for this," he hissed as the agents locked the handcuffs around his wrists. A wave of reactions rippled through the courtroom. People whispered, some recorded the moment, and others even applauded. Pam and Karoline exchanged a glance. They had won this battle. But the war was far from over. The judge turned pale in an instant. A flicker of something between fear and fury crossed his face. He clearly hadn't expected this outcome. His hands trembled, but he desperately tried to maintain his mask of composure. "This is absurd. You have no right," he blurted out, his voice shaking. But Pam Bondi wasn't going to give him time to think. "We don't just have the right, we have a duty. You abused your power, and now you will answer for it." Her voice was sharp and unwavering. Journalists made no effort to hide their excitement. Cameras flashed, capturing every twitch of the judge's face. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "No way. That's a respected judge. Doesn't seem so respectable now." Karoline Leavitt watched as the tension in the room thickened. This moment would go down in history. She saw the judge's frantic glances around the courtroom, searching for support, but even his own colleagues and assistants refused to meet his gaze. "You will all pay for this." The judge's voice climbed into hysteria. He straightened his posture, trying to appear commanding, but it was too late. "I demand that this madness stop." His eyes darted around the room, desperate. "Someone, put an end to this farce." No one moved. Pam stepped closer. "Your Honor, your court is over. Now, it's the law's turn to pass judgment." A federal agent approached, unfolding an official document before reading aloud. "Your Honor, under the charges of abuse of power and obstruction of justice, you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say may be used against you in a court of law." The handcuffs in his grip gleamed under the flashing lights of the cameras. The judge's furious eyes darted between the cuffs, Pam, and Karoline. "You set this up," he rasped. "You orchestrated everything. This is a conspiracy." "This is justice," Karoline said firmly. The judge took an involuntary step back, but two agents seized his arms. "No. No. You can't do this." His voice cracked as the cold steel cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. The click of the handcuffs echoed like a final sentence. "You'll regret this," he screamed as they led him away. The moment the doors closed behind him, the room erupted. People whispered, some laughed, others looked utterly stunned. Karoline turned to Pam. "That was loud," she murmured. Pam nodded. "That's exactly how it should be. People need to know that the law is not a toy." Within an hour, news stations played the arrest footage on repeat. Social media exploded with discussions, arguments, and debates over what had just unfolded. Karoline felt her phone vibrate. A message from an unknown number. "You made a mistake. You won't get away with this." She turned the screen to Pam, who frowned. "Looks like we have more work to do," she said. Karoline took a deep breath, knowing this victory was just the first step in a much larger fight. A new challenge was waiting for them. "Then it's time to prepare for the next battle," she said firmly. Pam smirked. "Exactly." The judge's arrest sent shockwaves through the media and the public. However, behind the scenes, something far more sinister was unfolding. The people tied to the corrupt system weren't going to sit idly by. Karoline felt it immediately. That evening, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You made a mistake. You won't be forgiven." A knot tightened in her stomach. This wasn't just a threat. It was a warning. She quickly forwarded the message to Pam. Minutes later, her phone rang. "We knew they wouldn't back down," Pam's voice was tense. "But this means we've hit a nerve. Do you think they'll go further?" Karoline asked, staring out the darkened window. A creeping fear stirred inside her. "I think they will," Pam paused. "And we need to be ready." The next day, Karoline discovered that her personal information had been leaked online. Journalists bombarded her with intrusive questions, and some media outlets attempted to paint her in a negative light. "They're trying to intimidate me," Karoline gripped her phone, scrolling through the latest smear campaign. "That's their first mistake," Pam stood beside her, arms crossed. "They think pressure will make you fold. But all they're doing is proving that we're on the right track." Then, things got worse. Karoline noticed she was being followed. A black car appeared on her street every evening. Unknown numbers called her phone at night, but no one ever spoke. One evening, as she approached her front door, she noticed a small piece of paper wedged between the frame. "Leave while you still can." A chill ran down her spine. This was no longer just intimidation. This was a direct signal. Karoline immediately called Pam. "They're getting aggressive," her voice was tight with tension. "I don't know what's coming next." "They want you to be scared," Pam's voice was calm. "But we're not giving them that power. Tomorrow, you're moving to a secure location. And I'm handling this." Karoline exhaled, realizing that standing her ground would come at a price. But retreat wasn't an option. Later that night, Pam was driving down an empty road when she noticed a vehicle tailing her. A black SUV followed at a steady distance, refusing to fall back. She increased her speed. The SUV matched her pace. A pulse of danger ran through her. Then, suddenly, the SUV lurched forward, trying to cut her off. Pam swerved sharply, avoiding a collision. Her heart pounded. "So, the game begins," she murmured, gripping the wheel. The next morning, Pam stood before the press, delivering a sharp statement. "The attempts to intimidate and silence us only confirm that we've exposed a corrupt network willing to do anything to protect itself. But I promise, we will see this through to the end." The media caught fire with the new development. The pressure on Karoline and Pam backfired on their enemies. Karoline understood that this was only the beginning. But now, they were ready. Threats, pressure, even physical attacks, it all only proved that the truth was on their side. "They made a mistake threatening us," she told Pam, watching the latest news unfold. "Now we strike back." Pam nodded. "We're not just continuing this fight. We're taking it all the way." After Pam Bondi's public statement, the pressure didn't ease, it only intensified. The powerful forces behind the court began acting in more sophisticated ways. New articles appeared in the media, accusing Karoline and Pam of staging the events. Those in power tried to reshape public opinion, pushing the narrative that the judge's arrest was just a political spectacle. Karoline read another headline: "Manipulation or Justice? Who is really behind the court scandal?" A surge of anger washed over her. "They're trying to twist reality," she said to Pam. "To make us the guilty ones." Pam frowned. "That means we're close to their weak spot. But now, we have to strike back." That same day, Pam and Karoline met with a group of independent journalists, people who weren't afraid to dig deep. They decided to release hard evidence of corruption, documents, phone call recordings, and witness testimonies. "We need massive outreach," Pam said, spreading the files across the table. "If they want to play propaganda, we'll show the people the facts." Karoline nodded. "The evidence speaks for itself. The key is delivering it the right way." Within 48 hours, the information began flooding the internet. Videos surfaced of the judge discussing problematic cases with officials. Documents confirmed secret deals and exchanged favors. The journalists did their job, the truth started to spread. The impact was stronger than they had anticipated. The public began demanding further investigations. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag justice not corruption. Hashtag Bondi versus the system. Pam looked at Karoline. They can't bury this now. Karoline smiled. They handed us the weapon themselves. But their enemies weren't giving up. The next morning, Pam's assistant, pale as a sheet, approached her. We just received this, he said, handing her an envelope. Pam opened it. Inside was a photograph of her car parked outside her home. On the back, a message was written. Your move next. Karoline noticed her reaction. What is it? Pam passed her the photo. Karoline clenched her fists. They're moving to direct threats. Which means they're scared, Pam said calmly. We need to push even harder. Amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. A former court employee, someone who had once worked under the arrested judge, reached out to Karoline. I have something to tell you, his voice trembled over the phone. But I need protection. Karoline looked at Pam. He might be our strongest asset yet. Pam nodded. Then let's play this right. The meeting with the whistleblower took place in a highly secure location. The man, who introduced himself as John Keller, looked exhausted but resolute. They threatened me if I ever spoke, he admitted. But after the judge's arrest, I knew this couldn't continue. He handed them audio recordings, conversations between high-ranking officials discussing bribes and the appointment of loyal judges. This is your key to dismantling the system, he said. But be careful. They won't stop now. The recordings became an instant sensation. No one could deny the scale of corruption anymore. Protests erupted in multiple cities, with people demanding a complete judicial reform. Karoline watched the news reports rolling in. At that moment, she realized. This is more than just one exposé. This is a war for the future. Pam placed a hand on her shoulder. And we're going to win it. Now, they faced a new challenge, not just exposing criminals but forcing real change. They knew more threats were coming, but there was no stopping them now. Karoline exhaled, scanning the latest headlines. There's no turning back now. Pam smiled. And we don't need to. We're moving forward. At the moment when it seemed that the truth was finally winning, Karoline and Pam's opponents made their next move. The recordings exposing corrupt officials had caused a massive public outcry. However, along with that, a wave of lies and slander crashed down on them. Karoline turned on the news and saw a high-ranking politician speaking. These recordings are fake. This is a dirty political game, and we will not allow our judges and officials to be smeared. Pam smirked. They're panicking. But the next day, the situation took a dangerous turn. Fake documents were leaked online, supposedly proving that Karoline herself was involved in corruption schemes. Social media exploded with accusations. They've decided to go after my reputation, Karoline said quietly, scrolling through the flood of allegations. It was inevitable, Pam tapped her fingers on the table thoughtfully. The real question is, who's behind this leak? The answer came quickly. One of the media channels actively pushing the false story was directly linked to the same corrupt officials they had exposed. That's their mistake, Karoline said. We can use this against them. Together with a team of lawyers and journalists, they crafted their response. Soon, an independent investigation proved that the documents had been fabricated and that the media outlets spreading them were being funded by the very same corrupt figures. When the truth came out, public opinion swung back in their favor. But Pam and Karoline both knew, their enemies wouldn't stop. They've made their move, Pam said, crossing her arms. Now it's our turn. When the truth finally came to light, the wave of public outrage reached its peak. People demanded justice. The investigation expanded, uncovering new evidence that confirmed the vast scale of corruption. The judge who had been arrested first agreed to cooperate with the authorities. In exchange for leniency, he provided names, those who orchestrated the bribery system and manipulated cases behind closed doors. His testimony became the final blow to the entire scheme. Karoline and Pam watched the news broadcast as the anchor reported. Several high-ranking officials have been arrested in connection with the corruption scandal that has shaken the nation. Pam exhaled. This isn't the end, but we've dealt a serious blow. Karoline nodded. We've proven that even the untouchable can be held accountable. A few weeks later, Pam received an envelope. Inside was a single word, next. She showed it to Karoline. They're not backing down, Karoline said quietly. Pam tightened her grip on the envelope and smirked. Neither are we.